Rural life and society. Rural life in Mughal times. During Mughal period, there were three types of land. The land given to mansabdars as Jagir was cultivated and its produce sold to get the income for the mansabdar. The Khalisa land was owned by the emperor and the cultivators paid 1/3 of the produce as tax. The Inam lands were tax-free, charitable lands given to mosques, temples, etc. The weakened central government after the decline of Mughal Empire could not collect taxes efficiently. So, the government started Ijara farming. Here, tax collectors or Ijara farmers were appointed as agents to collect tax and they kept 1/10 of the collected money. So, they were tempted to exploit the peasants because the more they collected, the more they kept for themselves. Zamindars during Mughal period came to denote all those who collected rent and did not own village land. In this sense, zamindars were intermediaries between the government and the peasants. Villages were self-sufficient units. Each village had a person called mandal or chief ryot who acted on behalf of the zamindar for collecting land revenue. Revenue collection in East India Company. After the Battle of Buxar, the company started to collect the land revenue in Bengal. As Diwan, the company became the chief financial administrator of the territory under its control. Now, it had to think of administering the land and organizing its revenue resources. This had to be done in a way that could yield enough revenue to meet the growing expenses of the company. The company needed regular income to build an army, train it, and expand it for conquering more places in India. The effort of the company was to increase the revenue as much as it could and buy fine cotton and silk cloth as cheaply as possible. Before 1865, the company had purchased goods in India by importing gold and silver from Britain. Now, the revenue collected in Bengal could finance the purchase of goods for export. Warren Hastings became the first Governor General of India. He auctioned the right to collect revenue to the highest bidder for a period of 5 years. This system was known as Ijardari system. It increased the misery of peasants as the bidding was done by rich merchants who were merely interested in collecting maximum revenue without taking into consideration the productivity of land. As auction of land was periodical, the new zamindars took no interest in the improvement of agricultural land. As a result, nobody benefited from it. The company did not get expected income, the zamindars felt insecure, and peasants were oppressed. Permanent settlement. Lord Cornwallis, who became the Governor General in 1786, introduced permanent settlement in Bengal and Bihar and later in Odisha. He wanted to increase the revenue of the company and thus decided to fix the land revenue to be collected. By the terms of the settlement, the Rajas and Talukdars were recognized as zamindars. They were asked to collect rent from the peasants and pay revenue to the company. The amount to be paid was fixed permanently, that is, it could not be increased ever in future. Thus, zamindar was made a landlord of the entire land from which till now he had only collected taxes. The cultivator now became his tenant and lost his rights. It was felt that this would ensure a regular flow of revenue in company's treasury and on the other hand encourage the zamindars to invest in improving the land. As revenue demands could not be increased, the zamindars would benefit from increased production from the land. Under this system, 90% of the revenue collected by the zamindar went to the company, 10% was kept by the zamindar. Lord Cornwallis made this settlement permanent by a regulation in 1793. It meant that company was assured of financial security, that is, a regular supply of income even in case of a bad harvest. It also increased British income as the rate of revenue was high. As zamindars were made the owners of land, this class became loyal to British. But the immediate effect of permanent settlement on zamindars was disastrous. Many of them could not realize land revenue from the peasants and consequently could not pay the money to government in time. Thus, they had no choice but to sell or mortgage part of their land to enable them to pay the revenue. The cultivators, on the other hand, were oppressed and had no rights to the land. They were left on the mercy of zamindars. As revenue was rigidly collected, the peasants were forced to borrow money from the moneylenders and landlords. When they failed to repay money, their mortgaged land was confiscated. They had to work as landless labor or as beggar, which made their lives utterly miserable. Thus, permanent settlement led to the deterioration of agriculture and impoverishment of peasantry. Vari system. As the disadvantages of permanent settlement became apparent, other systems were tried out in different parts of the country. The Vari system was introduced in Karnataka and Mysore at the instance of Thomas Munro and Captain Reed. Later on, it was also implemented in Bombay and Madras presidencies. In this system, the cultivators or ryots were given the right to occupy the land they cultivated and were recognized as owners of the land as long as they paid land revenue. The revenue demand was about half of the produce depending on the quality of soil and the nature of the crop. Under the Vari system, the revenue was fixed for a period of 30 years. There were no intermediaries or zamindars as revenue was directly collected from peasants. Revenue collection was rigid without any remission. The system was advantageous for cultivators as they had a right to their land. But again, the rigid revenue collection left them at the mercy of moneylenders. Moreover, the government had the right to increase the land revenue at will, and the peasant had to pay whether he increased his production or had famine in his area. In case he was unable to pay, he was transformed into a bonded labor. Mahal system. In Mahal system, the land was not owned by an individual, be it the zamindars or ryots, but a Mahal, which was a group of villages. Thus, the settlement was made with the village community themselves, as the Mahal was collectively regarded as the zamindar and the revenue was collected by the head of the Mahal. He was also called the talukdar. Thus, the payment of revenue was the collective as well as individual responsibility of the peasants. The Mahal system was first adopted in Agra and Awadh and later on extended to Madhya Pradesh, Punjab, Delhi and other parts of India. Here, again the basic ideals remained unachieved. The village headmen and prominent families retained the rights of the land, once again reducing common ryots into landless tenants. Thus, the social and economic inequalities increased and peasants' lot deteriorated. Effects on the people. The British economic policies had an annihilating effect on Indian economy. The status of landlords was reduced merely to rent collectors who were solely concerned with rent rather than improvement of agriculture. They became mouthpieces of British officials. It also impoverished peasantry as they were pushed into the clutches of the moneylenders who charged high interest from the peasants when they went to borrow money to pay taxes. When the peasants could not pay the interest, the moneylenders took over their lands. Unfortunately, even the legal system did not help the poor peasants as it was expensive to hire a lawyer, file a court case and fight it for years. Over a period of time, more and more land passed into the hands of rich farmers and moneylenders. Many more people became dependent on land, putting it under a lot of pressure. This happened as many artisans and craftsmen lost their jobs in towns as the demand for handicrafts declined. Due to decline in handicraft industry, the peasants lost the opportunity to earn extra money during the off-season. Disintegration of village community. The revenue system introduced by the British discouraged the joint family system and promoted individualism. People started concentrating on producing for the market instead of fulfilling the needs of village population. The exposure of the village to foreign products weakened the position of village craftsmen and artisans. With the advent of British economic policies, they became largely dependent upon the merchants for the sale of their products. Commercialization of agriculture. As a result of new revenue systems, agriculture got commercialized and production for market replaced production for the community. In order to pay land revenue in cash, the peasants had to sell their produce in the nearby market. As the prices were low, after the harvest, they were forced to sell at a very low price. The insistence on paying the land revenue in cash caused this problem. As a result of Industrial Revolution in England, the demand for cash crops like indigo, cotton, jute, and opium increased. They are called cash crops as they are sold in the market for cash. Peasants were forced to grow cash crops as landlords and merchants profited from their sales to British export firms. They pressurized peasants to grow these crops so that they could earn profitably. The total area under cultivation went up during this period, but the area available for food crops was reduced. The increasing cultivation of commercial crops adversely affected the total quantum of food grain production, so less food stock led to more famines. Peasants' revolts. The various land revenue laws passed by the British government hit the peasants hard. Between 1765 and 1857, a number of revolts were led by farmers and zamindars. Masses of peasants and sometimes former soldiers of princes also joined. Most of them were against imposing heavy land revenue or disposing a zamindar when he was unable to pay land revenue. The seventh decade of the 19th century witnessed large-scale land-related problems. The Mupla farmers of Kerala revolted against the oppression of zamindars. Then, there were Deccan riots in Pune and Ahmednagar districts in 1875. The Government of India appointed a commission which held that poverty and consequent indebtedness of the cultivators made them attack the rich moneylenders. The largest of such uprising was the revolt of 1857, the Indigo Revolts. The European traders wanted Indian peasants to cultivate indigo, for which there was no remuneration on some portion of their lands, failing which the cultivator had to face adversities like being kidnapped, tortured, and their crops being destroyed. The indigo agitation of Bengal in 1859-60 was directed against European planters whose exploitation had pushed the peasants to the wall. It was also supported by Bengali intelligentsia as well as press who had otherwise shown no interest in the earlier peasant movements. In 1860, all the cultivators undertook the first great general strike in the history of Indian peasantry. The strikers refused to sow indigo. The peasants faced the brutalities unleashed upon them by the landlords and the British officers with courage and determination. Neel Darpan, a famous play, portrayed the plight of indigo peasants, contributed a great deal to the nationalist movement in Bengal. The final blow to growing indigo came when a synthetic dye was invented. But indigo plantation continued in Bihar and many other parts of India. It was Mahatma Gandhi's efforts in 1918 that finally gave relief to the poor peasants of Champaran in Bihar. Wahhabi movement. This movement, which called upon Muslims to return to pure Islam, carried on a struggle against British rule. Muslims from all walks of life participated in the movement which soon spread across different parts of India. The movement was primarily religious in origin but soon assumed the character of a class struggle in some places where, irrespective of communal distinctions, peasants united against landlords. Fakir and sannyasi rebellion movements in and around Bengal were also movements of mass uprising. Punjab, a case study. Canal irrigation brought about many changes in Punjab. The introduction of Persian wheel gave boost to irrigation. It was further boosted with the construction of some famous canals built by different rulers. The coming of the British witnessed the introduction of a relatively advanced technology. Extensive canal systems were raised along with the establishment of some industries. After colonizing Punjab, the British followed a policy of rapid agricultural development. Canal irrigation was the primary input for that purpose. The Upper Bari Doab Canal was the first one to be built in 1860. It mainly aimed at generating employment to rehabilitate the disbanded Sikh army personnel. The Sirhind Canal was completed by 1887. Later, many large-scale irrigation projects were undertaken, perfecting the skills of canal engineering. They tapped the waters of 5 rivers and turned the vast tracts of Doab that earlier supported only pastoral activities to arable lands. Despite its dry climate, extensive irrigation made it a rich agricultural region. The canal irrigation system established by the British is the largest in the world. Conclusion: the peasant revolts were directed at aggressive economic policies of the British which shattered the traditional agrarian system of India. Though these revolts were not aimed at uprooting British rule from India, it created a consciousness among the Indians about the need to organize and fight against exploitation.